Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining Alastair and I at today's fourth webinar in the series. Today we're talking to Alastair about out of your closet.
Indeed, out of the closet, yes.
Out of the closet. So, Alastair, we would like to talk about, obviously, your role as a general valuer and what goes through the process of when you see a client. So can you tell us a little bit about that before we start talking wardrobes?
Sure. So that's my role as general valuer at Doerr Dallas. I think the main thing is I'm the first person through the door, and I'm the first person to talk to them about, the items within their house, that when we discuss such things as the paintings on the walls to the furniture. And I think one of the things that we really kind of have to look at is the general contents. And the general contents really is the thing that we're here today to talk about. And it's the thing that really, I think, surprises most people and kind of makes most people kind of worried about their policies.
When you go in to see a client and, you obviously introduce yourself and you're taking them through the procedure of what a valuation is, because obviously you play with two hats. You can either be doing a full valuation or you can be doing what we call the walkthrough validation. So when you go in and do the walkthrough validation, you obviously have a client's policy, which gives you an idea, and you'll have looked at that policy prior to walking into the house. With a full valuation, obviously, we're going in not necessarily blind, but there may have been a pre-assessment that's taken place. There may have been a previous schedule, and you may have met the client before. But when you've got an idea and you're taking them through that, what's the first thing that you do when you're going through that process?
I think the first thing you have to do with a client, especially with general contents, where it's going to be really about discussing with them, to a certain degree, what they've got. First thing to do is to sit down and have a cup of tea, to be perfectly honest, because you need to be able to chat to them and be on a certain level with them, because ultimately a lot of people, when they're talking about clothing or such items and shoes, it's not the most comfortable thing to be talking about. You can be talking about the constable on your kitchen wall, but to talk about the 20 Dior ball gowns in your wardrobe is a little bit more, I don't know, people just don't like talking about it as much. So I think getting the trust of the client that you can talk about it, and I hate to say it, but sometimes getting the trust of one part of the partnership potentially and speaking to the other part of the partnership separately about it. It's a unique thing to be talking about, but that's the best way that I would start to approach it, definitely.
Why do you feel that wardrobes are often overlooked? I mean, we certainly, from valuations that we've done, we've seen huge values. And I think gone is the day where there's a client that has £10,000 worth of clothes. We are now seeing clients that, you can go into a very mid-net worth, nothing flash client's home with maybe £200,000 worth of general contents, and £100,000 of that can be wardrobe. So, they obviously previously have been overlooked, and we're still seeing that. Why do you think that's the case?
Whether it's been previously overlooked or not, I don't know. But I think certainly in the last couple of decades, I think clothes are almost a modern collectible in many ways, that people used to love collecting, let's say, Meissen figurines or something like that, which they've kind of fallen by the wayside in terms of popularity. What people like to think about collecting these days are things that have some practical purpose as well, that aren't in at the cabinet. So shoes, or I mean, if you've read my article on handbags, which, as you unfortunately know, is one of my passions, it's people like to collect these things, and people have put more time and effort into them. And I think over the last couple of decades, people have really enjoyed collecting clothing. And again, I think a big factor is accumulative value, because I think people buy new clothes every year, and what people don't necessarily do is throw away old clothes. And I know I've certainly got a few old suits that I'd love to be able to wear. If I lost a bit of weight, I could probably get around to wearing them again. But it's I think that there's often that in people's wardrobes as well.
I was going to say, Alastair, that's normally a female's complaint rather than a male.
Well,
I know mine is certainly the case.
well,
So, but as we're seeing clients, and I think, you know, would you say that disposable income has become greater? You know, are people finding that because necessarily funds aren't making huge amounts in banks, are they spending more on clothes? I know that certainly I have a summer and a winter wardrobe that I change, and I go through my wardrobe, and obviously even myself I'm acquiring, but I'm, you know, wouldn't class myself as a high net worth or as an ultra high net worth client. But I know that a number of my friends that are in that status, not only do they have somebody that brings clothes to their home, but when they pack, you know, often they will have somebody that will be assisting them packing, you know, and believe you me, the places that they go to, they don't unpack either. But, you know, it is clothes for an event, clothes for an social, whether it's holiday or so. Have we changed in our
I think the way in which people buy clothing now and the way in which people use clothing has changed just so dramatically. And I think it's a good example to say, you know, high net worth clients won't necessarily go to a shop and buy things themselves. They'll have things brought to them, and if somebody is packing them, they'll have them packed away for them. And I think what has brought this on, I think it's that gradual trickle down from almost celebrity status, where that used to happen, to ultra high net worth, to high net worth, and now we're almost in a position where mid net worth individuals will have items for one season and then wouldn't be caught dead wearing them the next season, but they'll still keep hold of them. And I think that's the accumulative kind of side of things. But I think as well, in terms of not just women's clothing, but men's clothing, I think it's completely acceptable nowadays for men to spend pretty much exactly the same amount on clothing as women do, be it on a nice pair of Ferragamo shoes or something along those lines. And I think these days, it used to be a case of, you know, people would go and buy a suit from Henry Poole or something, and that would do them until the day they died. Whereas these days, you know, people are spending more on this type of things, and if they are having bespoke things made, the cost of having those bespoke things made has gone through the roof. So a suit that could have been $2.5 grand, $3 grand at Henry Poole's maybe 10, 15 years ago is 8 to 10 grand now for a decent suit. And I think that is where things are changing. You know, it's just the accumulative thing. You know, I can look at my rack of shirts. I've got maybe 40 shirts or something, and it's £100 a shirt, and you don't think about it until you kind of look at it. And I think when we go round and look at properties and actually go through these items with them, I think a lot of the clients don't realise what they've got until you actually start discussing it.
I think that's very true, and I think that is the case that, you know, when I've seen clients myself, or when reports have come back, you know, you can see that clients aren't aware of what they have. And I think depending on what level that client is, you know, we see it all the time that they say, oh, we're not clothes people. Yes, they may not be clothes people, and I totally get that. But what they are is they have a social life, and that social life will have black tie events, will have the polo, will have the ski gear. So it's not, it may be that they don't think they're clothes people because maybe fashion isn't their, it's something they get excited by. However, they will, you know, we all have to have clothes. And if you're going to these social events and you're wearing named pieces, I think obviously that's what we do see. The other day, Alastair, you actually went out to see a client that had been burgled.
Yes.
Not, you know, sad times. And when he initially phoned me to say that he needed us to come out, it was slightly after the horse had bolted. But what he did say to me is that in his wardrobe, they had suffered quite a large hit from theft. But the burglars obviously knew exactly what they were taking. You know, dare I say it, the Marks and Spencer's jumper was left behind, you know, but the named pieces had gone. So they very much were aware of what to take. And he was quite shocked. And the reason why we were going out is that he was quite shocked at the level of underinsurance that he had, and wanted to make sure that that position didn't happen again. So, you know, how do you broach the subject with clients over their wardrobes?
I think it's a sensitive matter, and I think everything is a sensitive matter with some clients. And the funny thing is when you're talking about, let's say, a painting that may have gone up 50% in value over the last 10 years, generally, I would say, you know, a significant amount of people are pleased about that because they feel it's an investment and they feel it's gone up in value. So therefore, naturally, they'll want to insure it at a figure that we deem to be representative of what it's worth. But as soon as you get on to talking about a clothing allowance or wardrobe allowance, should I say, they actually, you know, clamor up a little bit and are kind of like, well, you know, as you quite rightly said, a lot of them say, well, we're not clothes people. But then you start talking about it and go, okay, so let's talk about what you're up to this weekend. Oh, you're going shooting next weekend? Right, okay, so let's start talking about your DeBarry wellies and then your shuffle coats and then everything that goes with that. And then in a couple of weeks, you're off skiing. And when we get into ski gear, it's just a completely different kind of matter because this ski clothing goes into storage for 6 months of the year, well, 4 months if you're lucky, and then you know, it gets used again and again and again. But the cost of that is you know, can be astronomical, and people don't include this. But I think it's the funny thing for me is people just don't look at the overall picture. So again, a rather awkward point is to say, okay, well, what do you spend on underwear? What do you spend on swimwear? What do you spend on, you know, you wouldn't believe it, but you know, some people really do spend tens of thousands of pounds easily on underwear and swimwear, and when you look at it, they just haven't really taken it into consideration.
Well, I was going to say, darling, you can't be seen to be in the same things the same time over and over again. Nobody would want that.
I've seen you in Biarritz in the same swimsuit, Rachel, year after year.
I wish. But also what people forget within clothing is it's the winter coats, it's the summer max, it's the jackets, it's the leathers. You know, it's taking you through that whole length and breadth of what you own. And then going into shoes, handbags. And then we've forgotten, obviously, the sports equipment. And then, as we have mentioned previously, it's your glasses, it's your sunglasses. And as we know, Alastair, you have an extensive collection of sunglasses.
Well, I think glasses are a really good example because you can easily spend £400 or £500 on a pair of glasses. I've got quite a few pairs of glasses, and it does stack up. But again, people don't think about it because it's this accumulation thing. Again, going back to the coats, I think I mentioned it in my article where I said, if you spent £2,000 on a coat, would you necessarily tell your broker that year that you've increased it by £2,000? You probably wouldn't. But then 3 or 4 years when you've bought, you know, and they've gone up in value, so you actually end up with about 20 grand's worth of coats that you hadn't really thought about doing it because it didn't really matter that year. But accumulation of these things, it just keeps on totting up. And generally with clothes, as I say, people don't throw them away in the same way that you buy a new set of pots and pans and throw the old ones away. You'd keep every, you know, bits of clothing just in case you had a reason to wear them. And I think that's the accumulation thing that just keeps going up and up and up. But I think going to my other article, which I wrote on handbags, I think that's a really, really good example of where it's become a modern collectible, really, not just a piece of fashion. It's a piece of art.
Well, I was going to say, in your article, you actually detailed the bag that George Condo did for Birkin.
Yeah.
And as we see from, again, there was a series done by a number of the artists for Birkin, which obviously had a premium price. But again, I think the manufacturers of handbags, watches, things like that, where you can have a limited series, or you can be putting out a special edition. And you last year attended a very nice ladies' home who was a very professional lady in her own right, with obviously a large disposable income. She was a professional, but she was part of a collector group. And tell us a little bit about her without saying names.
No. I mean, lovely lady. And I initially got a call to go and have a look at her handbag collection. We discussed briefly the kind of thing that she was into, but to be perfectly honest, I think she underplayed it. And when I turned up, I think it's a classic thing, whereas some of our valuers would go into a house and see a fantastic Banksy on the wall and fall to their knees. I was kind of similar with the handbags, to be perfectly honest, because it was just such an extraordinary collection of just some absolutely fantastic models. And I think there are people that, she didn't necessarily spend a lot of money on anything other than fashion, from what I could see, but every season she would spend maybe 250,000 on handbags, so about $1 million a year. And a lot of the things, such as events such as Wimbledon or racing events and things like that, she couldn't ever use the same bag more than once. But if she didn't have that bag, then people would think that she was behind because she didn't have that bag for that particular thing. And I think there can be a lot of pressure with these things. But in terms of the collectors groups, I think people like Hermes or Bottega Veneta or Chanel really do take care of their clients. And, she gets, shipped all around the world to look at different collections. Wow. And asked if, she would like to purchase them. And, I imagine 99% of the time she does. It's the same as when you buy a Ferrari. If you buy a Ferrari, you get invited to buy the next Ferrari. If you don't buy that Ferrari, you don't invite it. It's a similar thing. But it's the same with Rolex as well. You'll get invited to buy the following ones. If you buy it, works on a very, very clever system that, let's be perfectly honest, the manufacturers know what they're doing. It is a fascinating subject.
So as we go through a valuation and you're with a client, I mean, are you literally there with a pad and pen doing X times so many suits? And as we know, even silk ties, a man doesn't have one tie. So do you do an assessment of actually what's in the wardrobe and then look at things like shoes and then come up with an agreed value with the client?
I think a lot of the time with a client, getting a correct wardrobe valuation is not just about looking in the wardrobe. It's looking at the rest of the property and the rest of their spending habits and working out, because ultimately we're not looking at what they've paid for these items, we're looking at what it would cost to replace. And I think this is a big factor where I think a lot of clients get a little bit confused as to, I bought that 20 years ago for 500 quid, so therefore it's going to be worth 500 quid. No, that's not how it works. I think generally, as I said, I would initially have a good chat with them and work out where they buy things, how they would replace things, what they would replace, whether they would go for a similar model or something along those lines. And then looking at the wardrobe, it's easy to determine, well, to my eyes at least, it's easy to determine whether they're, high street or they're designer or they're couture. And when it gets to the couture kind of section of things, it's difficult, but you can kind of get as much information as you can out of the clients and sometimes out of the designer. Problem being with things like, especially couture, when the amount of pieces are so limited that trying to actually value something on a similar level is difficult, but you can get there eventually in terms of those valuations. So yes, a pad and a pen is very helpful, but with some items I've seen, it's a lot of phone calls, to be perfectly honest, because you're talking about 4 or 5 figure dresses, and you would do exactly the same for a piece of artwork. You do the research, you do the looking into it, you'd speak to the artist, and it's exactly the same with a dress or a handbag or a pair of shoes.
Well, I am aware you had a very nice trip to Hermes last year, doing some research on a client for their wardrobe.
Oh, they were lovely and very, very accommodating, and yes, they're certainly not scared of their brand there. I got a cup of coffee in a Hermes cup on a Hermes coaster on a Hermes tray, which I was quite impressed about. But they're perfectly aware of their brand values
and their prices.
Yes, I mean, but that's what it is. I mean, if you like that kind of thing, I mean, as you well know, we've had clients that spend a lot of money at Hermes.
Well, I mean, just looking at the market and looking at clothing, I mean, I know certainly I never would have ever dreamt that there would be auctions for handbags and there would be auctions for trainers. And if you put a signature on a trainer, it becomes a very different thing to a piece of clothing. But I mean, what's your opinion of the auction market? Do things like handbags continue to hold their value?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think even when I started, not quite so many years ago as you, Rachel, but I think to look at an auction for handbags would have been ridiculous. People bought handbags, and yes, people spent some money on them, but the idea that handbags were collectible in any way, you'd buy one, it would wear out, you'd buy another one, but now people are buying them, and the collectability factor of them has just gone through the roof. To spend 6 figures on a handbag, on a rare Hermes crocodile 35 or something like that with gold fittings, you know, it's not unusual that people will spend that amount of money, but it's this collectability thing. And I think with high net worth as well, a lot of them will buy them and put them in a wardrobe and be happy knowing that they own them. They don't necessarily even come out of the dust carrier. It's unique, but that's the market for it. And trainers, I'm pleased you picked up on that. It's a slightly different market, but I think it's come from the States in the last kind of 5 or 6 years. People releasing very, very, very limited edition trainers, and it's a fascinating market. I mean, it's dictated somewhat by the music scene over there, and the fact that people want to own these specific trainers that were maybe designed by a musician, and people like that. But some of these things, Nike will release, 10 pairs of one of these trainers, retail them at a couple of $100, and they can literally sell for $50,000-$60,000 the day after they've been sold on the open market, because people just want them. But it's the same as Birkins, in the fact that Birkins, generally speaking, there are some that have a lot higher prices than others, but the ones that are actually literally just soaring away in value, some of the time were just the very, very normal, I say normal, 15, 20 grand new handbags that are now going to £100,000 bags. It's remarkable.
And is that because of the maker, because of the design, because of the limited availability? Did they not do them in many numbers? What actually creates that?
I think, the starting point, and I think using the Birkin as a starting point is the easiest thing to look at. I think the Birkin is an exquisitely designed, exquisitely made handbag. The quality of it hasn't really dipped at all. And you look at a lot of ultra kind of high quality items, some shoes, of a pair of Gucci loafers these days is not quite as good quality as they used to be, for example, but a Birkin will always be incredibly good quality. The fittings are exquisite and everything else is good. So you have that starting point, but then what makes it rare and what makes it collectible is the limited numbers. It's always the limited numbers. If you've got a green crocodile skin Birkin 35, again, probably with palladium fittings, it's a ridiculous amount of money because they didn't make that many of them, and they know that they can sell them at a reasonable amount of money if they limit the amounts. And it's exactly the same kind of theory as we've probably talked about in the past with Rolex, where Rolex will make just not quite enough, so you go on a waiting list and people want it, and that desire to own one means that people will always go on a waiting list, and they will get one. But again, as we spoke about with my client from last year, they will happily go and spend XYZ on a bag, not necessarily because they want it, but because they want to know that the next one that is released, they will get an opportunity to buy it.
Alastair, we've had a question from Linda. She had a client that purchased a Birkin bag second hand. So I don't know where she purchased it from was obviously legitimate. Sometimes when clients think a deal is too good, often it can be. But she said, obviously, I think the client may have had quite a few, so knew what to look for, but didn't spot that it was a fake until she actually got Hermes to look at it. Now, they wouldn't divulge why it was a fake, but obviously it was. And, you know, how can you tell the difference? Do you know any spots to look for?
Fakes are a huge market, and I think it's exactly the same as Rolex, where there's probably about 5 times the amount of fakes in circulation around the world as there are real ones, because people want them. Louis Vuitton bags are the prime example. 90% of things that you see in the airport are fake, because they're just so widely replicated. I think with Hermes and the bags there, the problem is the fakes are so good that to the untrained eye, you really wouldn't know. The quality is really the point where you start to look at it. The rigidity of the leather, the trimming on it, the printing on the inside of a Hermes bag. There's a printing there, and you can sometimes tell by the printing. But I understand why Hermes don't want to give away the details, because ultimately they'll be just giving more details to the fakers to make them better. To be perfectly frank, the counterfeit market is so strong these days that when a new bag comes out, the counterfeiters will own one within 48 hours and be working on it, and then will probably bring out something that is remarkably good for a tenth of the price. But ultimately, they're still fakes, so you wouldn't really want to have one. But it is very difficult to tell, and I think people that have had them before that think they know what they're buying, I think it's a bit of a risky business. And again, you are totally right in the fact that you need to be able to buy one and know exactly where it's from. Hermes and a lot of people aren't particularly happy about authenticating things unless you go in and you need to have some work done on it or something like that, because they'll never work on a fake. I think you just need to know where you're buying from. And if you are buying secondhand, be very wary and make sure you know the people that you're buying from.
Obviously, when we're looking at clothing, we don't just look at, as I said, it's not just clothing, we look at other things as well, like handbags, like luggage, like collections of sunglasses or scarves or whatever, to literally put that value together when we're looking for an insurance value. I had a lady that phoned me probably about 3 or 4 months ago, before all this madness started. She made me giggle because she had been asked by her insurance company to basically fulfill a form. And the form must have been quite regimented on different values for different items. And she phoned me up and she said that she'd been given our number by her broker, and she understood that we could help her with placing values. And was that the case? And I said, yes, very much so. She asked me if we did look at clothings and linens and carpets and curtains. And I said, yes, we also include that, as well as fine art and jewellery. We do the whole spectrum. But the bit that made me laugh is the insurance company had sent her a form, and she said they started one Sunday morning, her and her husband, and they only got into the dining room, being the first room. And when he found out that she'd spent £25,000, basically it was going to be divorced. So she because she said, this just isn't working, us doing it. And the reason I'm asking or telling you this is more the fact that, do you find when you go to clients' homes, it is the women that are doing the spending and it's the men doing the insuring? So it doesn't often. Ali?
I think sometimes, and not necessarily whether it be the woman or the man, I think in some relationships, one partner can be the spender and one person can be the person that does the insurance. I'm not putting any kind of anyway. But I think to a lot of degrees, I think when it comes to things like curtains, then generally speaking, somebody will spend a pretty decent amount on them. And again, the person that's not involved in let's say curtains would be incredibly surprised how much curtains can cost for, let's say, a reasonable 4-bedroom house or something like that in central London. You're spending a decent amount of money on furniture, on art. You're not going to skimp on the curtains, and for me to come out of somewhere that spent 50 grand, 60 grand on curtains is really not particularly unusual. And when it comes to carpeting as well, it's not unusual for somebody to spend 10 grand on a Persian rug. So why wouldn't you spend 10 grand, 15 grand on a room of fitted carpets? And I think that's totally normal as well. But do I think that one person knows and one person spends? I think it happens. In terms of, to put it in clothing and handbags, I think your asset, possibly, yes.
I mean, we have been to some beautiful houses where they've got, men's dressing rooms, ladies' dressing rooms, both have their own bathrooms. Sometimes they may even have their own bedrooms. But you do get to see that within that dressing room, the value of items being stored in there, whether it's the luggage, handbags, shoes, clothing, but often you will get even the jewellery, the safe, and cufflinks and things like that for men. So, the value in these rooms can be pretty high. And
certainly. I think it's where especially in a man's dressing room, it's where he'll keep all his fragrances. It's where he'll keep all of his watches, his accoutrements, his tie clips, his cufflinks, everything that goes in that kind of thing. And last year or so, I think in a gentleman's dressing room, I found a rather nice watch that I don't think anyone thought existed, and as such, that kind of was quite a surprise to the family. But it's I think the bedroom, the dressing room, the wardrobe, it's just as an important part as anywhere else, because I don't think people realise what they spend on it, and I don't think people give it the full, I hate to use the term respect, but I don't think they give it the respect that it deserves.
So your advice for a broker, is it make sure your client at least has a walkthrough, if nothing else?
I think a walkthrough is a really, really, really good point for high net worth clients that are looking at, they've got a good idea, they've had figures done before, but I think to update figures is the most important thing, and to update replacement figures on these things. And I think a lot of people that necessarily, they had a decent idea at some point, but then it's obviously changed in the last few years. And I think with clothing, it's a good, affordable way of actually looking at a good run through.
Henry's mentioned that often we talked about the theft of a client's wardrobe, and as you have quite rightly pointed out in your own, there are clothes within it that you wouldn't necessarily replace should there be a loss. So when you're coming up with a value, is that considered?
The clothing is such a personal thing, and I think you can't, for example, if I was just doing a wardrobe allowance for somebody and the client wasn't necessarily there, would I find it a little bit more difficult? Potentially, because I need to know from that client what they would replace, what's in there just because they haven't had time to take it out, what's in there because it is literally there, it might be there for when they decide to paint the side of the house, who knows. But I think it really is, you have to work with the client so much on these things, and coming from my angle that is completely impartial, and being able to look at it as an entity as opposed to a dress that they remember wearing on a certain cruise, or something else that they remember wearing at an occasion, or a wedding dress or something like that. You have to look at all the different aspects of the value in these items.
Yes, I was going to say, I think I've got a pair of shoes in the back of the cupboard that cost me a fortune. They were so expensive, it scared me how much they were, but they were for a wedding, and I wore them a couple of days leading up to the wedding to help me walk in them. And then after that, I've never worn them, but they cost me so much, I won't throw them away and still hope I'll get.
You can't bring yourself to do it. I think I mentioned in my article that I bought a relatively expensive pale blue Paul Smith suit for a garden party once, and I wore it once, and I kind of looked at photos of myself and said, why on earth did I buy that? But I've still kept it because there might be some occasion where it makes sense.
Now, Diane has asked us if we've got any stats for wardrobes with regards to underinsurance. Diane, when we go out to a client's home and we've got previous figures, we do keep a tally of what that underinsurance is, but it tends to be under the guise of general contents and then fine art and then jewellery. Personally, Alastair, I wouldn't know, but can you give any information to the brokers where you think that clients may, or an approximate percentage, be underinsured?
I would say when you look at general contents as a whole and not just putting into a little box clothing, I think general contents is one of those things that people just don't consider in the same way, because the cost of replacing the cutlery, the cost of replacing the crockery, the cost of replacing the white goods, the cost of replacing the linens, the cost of replacing all these things that people, they're really, they love having fine art, they love having expensive individual items, but the cumulative total, we keep coming back to this cumulative total kind of thing, of all of these general contents just goes up and up and up. I would say, I think we did some work on it, that about 70% of people in terms of general contents, it's going to be around that kind of figure, were underinsured, because I think, again, people in high net worth situations will continually add to what they have, and they're not going to, get rid of one dinner service and then replace it with one that's less expensive, for example. So it's going to be a continual kind of thing where things are getting more expensive, and the cost of replacing these things is going to continually go up.
Well, I think that we mentioned in our first webinar with regards to clients, and at the moment they're at home, they're probably easy pickings to literally pick up the phone and have a conversation with your client. And if you are reviewing their contents, then maybe this is a time to actually have that discussion. Again, we've said that both myself and Alastair will be happy to get on a call with you and your clients if you want us to ask the awkward questions or ask the questions from the valuer's point of view. We look at things very differently to how you look at things, because it's our job to make sure that should a client have the reason for a claim, that they are in the position that they can replace their life and their possessions with the current status quo.
I mean, my line, just to interject, my line has always been, you're sat down with the client across the table and saying, okay, doomsday scenario happens. Nobody wants it to happen, but it does happen. Doomsday happens, and you have to make a phone call from the rented accommodation that your insurer has provided you, and you have to replace your life. Could you do that with the amount that you've got? We're using wardrobe as an example here, but could you genuinely replace what you have in your wardrobe with the amount that you're insured for? And the amount of times that Mr. or Mrs. will look back to each other and say, do you think we could? And they'll say, well, actually, no. It's a difficult one, and I think you really have to instill that into them. It's not just I think we might get away with that kind of. It is genuinely a figure to replace your life.
And as we know, when somebody suffers a loss, it's always the worst time for anybody. So
nobody wants to be going to. Nobody wants to be going to a John Lewis sale, do they? To go and replace all their clothes 2 days after their house is burnt down. It's it's not an ideal situation to be in, and I think to make it easy, as easy as possible for your client to replace these items with a figure that is applicable is the best scenario.
Linda's just asked us a question with regards to valuing an item. She is talking about a piece of jewellery, Alastair, which I know is not your field. Can we do it remotely? It depends what information you have, Linda. If your client has a GIA certificate for the diamonds, and we know the cut, the clarity and the colour and the carat size, then yes, we can do it remotely. Otherwise, there's an element that, and I don't know whether you caught Mary's webinar 2 weeks ago on jewellery, but there's a lot of testing that goes on. There's a lot of measuring. So jewellery valuations are quite complex in how they take place. I mean, I've always giggled because Mary looks as though she's staying for 2 weeks when she arrives, because she carries natural daylight lamps, she carries testers, as does James. So they come with a whole suitcase of items that assist them with their valuation. But if you want to drop us a line at inquiries@doerrvaluations.co.uk, I will more than happily help you. But we are saying to clients, if they want to send us photographs at the moment, we will do our best to provide you with an opinion. And if they need an updated desktop, then we can help them with that too. So Alastair, thank you so much for your insight today, as always.
Pleasure as always. Pleasure as always.
Thank you everyone for attending. We very much enjoy it and we hope you do too. I can't see that we've got any more questions. I was going to say, I did have one sent to me by, oh, can't find it, by somebody asking a question over digital downloads. I'm not quite sure what you mean by a digital download. Do you know, Alastair?
No, I would say drop us an email. if it's digital, then put it on an email.
Dawn, if you could drop me an email, I will do my best to answer your inquiry. Thank you again to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon. I hope everyone's staying safe and well, and you know where we are if we can help. Thanks very much and have a lovely afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.